I'm here to help you fall asleep tonight. Before we begin, like the video, subscribe, and tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let the story carry you into the night. The Last Signal. In the spring of 2010, a quiet stretch of countryside just outside a small town in Maine remained untouched by modern life. Cell reception was poor, the internet barely worked, and for a man named David Rowe, that was the point. David, 32, had left city life behind after a messy divorce. He moved into an old rental cabin near the edge of the woods, a sagging structure with warped windows and faded yellow paint, but peaceful. The kind of place where nights were so quiet you could hear your own breath. Each evening, David would sit by the cabin's single radio, a battered hand crank unit he'd found at a thrift store. No cell bars, no TV, just static and the occasional crackle of distant stations. It was comforting, in its way. The world felt far, far away. But on one particular night, after a long day of chopping wood and trying to patch a leaky roof, the radio came to life in a way it never had before. First, static, then, a voice, faint, crackling through the interference. Help me? David froze. The voice was so soft it could have been imagined. But then it came again, clearer. I don't know where I am. Please, can anyone hear me? He turned the dial, trying to sharpen the signal. It was a woman, young, maybe mid-20s. She sounded terrified. It's so dark, there's nothing here. Just trees. Please, if someone's listening. David felt a chill crawl up his neck. He grabbed the radio and tried to respond, but it wasn't a two-way. He had no way to talk back. They're coming back. Please, the voice broke into static again. Hours passed. David sat motionless, his hand still gripping the radio's handle. The cabin's clock ticked steadily, the only other sound besides the soft hiss of static. Every so often, he turned the dial, hoping the woman's voice would return. But it didn't. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees that bordered his clearing rustled, their branches tapping against the windows like thin, bony fingers. David tried to convince himself it was a prank, maybe a pirate radio station, or some odd transmission bouncing off the atmosphere. But deep down, he didn't believe that. Sleep wouldn't come. Around 2 a.m., David lit the lantern and stepped outside onto the creaking porch. The moon hung low behind a veil of clouds, casting the clearing in dim silver light. He scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone, anyone, stumble out of the woods. Nothing, just shadows and the endless forest beyond. But then, just as he was about to go back inside, he heard it. A faint voice carried on the wind. Please, help me? No radio this time. It came from the trees. David's heart pounded. He grabbed his flashlight, slipped on his boots, and, against every instinct, crossed the yard and stepped into the woods. The light's narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and brambles, but no person. Hello? He called. Where are you? No answer. He pressed on, deeper, until the cabin's glow was just a memory. The voice came again, closer now. This way. It was the same woman. But something about the tone, soft, coaxing, felt wrong. Too calm for someone lost. Too steady. David stopped. The air had grown cold. The woods were unnaturally quiet. No insects, no night birds. Just the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then died. David stood in utter blackness. And from somewhere just ahead, the voice spoke once more, no longer pleading, but whispering, eager. There you are. David's breath caught in his throat. The whisper had come from no more than a few feet ahead, close enough that he could almost feel it in the air, as if whoever, whatever, had spoken were standing right there in the dark. Slowly, he stepped backward, careful not to snap a branch or make a sound. His mind raced. Get back to the cabin. Now. But the voice followed, soft and lilting. Don't go. He turned and bolted, hands outstretched to avoid the trees, stumbling over roots and stones. The night seemed to press in tighter with each step, and the forest floor felt endless beneath his feet. Behind him, he could hear the faintest sound. Footsteps? No, more like dragging, like something heavy moving just out of sight. Finally, after what felt like hours but was surely only minutes, David burst into the clearing. The sight of the cabin, small, battered, but there, filled him with relief. He sprinted up the steps, slammed the door behind him, and shoved the bolt into place. Inside, the radio crackled again. You shouldn't have left the woods. David stared at the device, heart hammering. The voice was different now. Deeper, mocking. The lantern flickered. Outside, Something moved across the clearing, a shadow, tall and thin, gliding between the trees, pausing just beyond the edge of the porch light. Watching, David backed away from the window. The radio hissed, then fell silent. That night, he sat awake until dawn, listening to the wind, the creaks of the old cabin, and the occasional soft tap at the window that he refused to look at. When morning came, the clearing was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone, but the radio never worked again. And sometimes, even in daylight, David swore he could hear a voice, far off in the trees, calling his name. Days passed. David tried to convince himself it had all been his imagination, a trick of exhaustion, of isolation, of the eerie quiet that blanketed the woods. But the unease clung to him like the morning mist. Every night, as darkness fell, the air seemed colder. The forest, once peaceful, felt like it was watching him. And then came the scratches. At first, faint, just a soft scraping at the cabin's walls, like branches brushing against the siding. But David had trimmed those trees back his first week there. No branches could reach that far. The sounds came again the next night. Louder, closer, clawing at the wood near the window, at the door, beneath the cabin itself. David stayed inside, clutching the old hatchet he'd kept by his bed. Lantern burning low, eyes wide, staring at the door, waiting for dawn. But as the hours dragged on, something new happened. A tap at the window. Then another. And then, so softly it barely registered, a voice. "Let me in." David didn't move, he barely breathed. The voice came again, more insistent. "David, I'm cold. Let me in." It knew his name. His grip on the hatchet tightened. His eyes flicked to the window, but he couldn't bring himself to look out. The voice circled the cabin, calling to him from every side. Sometimes the woman's voice, sometimes something else, deeper, cracked and hollow. When dawn broke, the voice stopped. The scratching ceased. The clearing stood empty, as if nothing had ever been there. But in the soft earth beneath the window, David found prints, not boot prints, not bare feet. Long, narrow marks, like fingers, or claws. That day, he packed what little he had. He left the cabin behind, never looking back. Yet at night, even years later, in the safety of a city apartment, sometimes, just sometimes, David would wake to a soft static hum from the corner of his room. And a voice, distant but familiar, whispering, "Let me in." David tried to rebuild his life in the city. After fleeing the cabin, he found a small apartment in Portland, a place surrounded by busy streets, glowing signs, and the constant hum of life. Here, he thought, he would be safe. At first, the city noises soothed him. The rattle of buses, the chatter of neighbors, the flicker of streetlights outside his window, all reminders that he was far from that lonely clearing in the woods. But peace didn't last. It began with the dreams. Night after night, David found himself standing at the edge of a dark forest in his sleep. The trees stretched endlessly before him, their branches twisted like grasping hands. Somewhere deep within the shadows, he would hear that voice, soft, distant, calling his name. "David, why did you leave me?" Each time, he woke with a start, his heart pounding, the sound of the voice echoing in his mind. Soon, it wasn't just in his dreams. Late one night, as the city outside fell quiet, David heard a familiar sound, static. Faint at first, a soft crackle, as if a radio were left on somewhere nearby. But he owned no radio. The sound grew louder over the nights that followed. The static seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around him. And beneath it, hidden in the noise, he began to hear words, that same voice from the woods, now twisted and hollow. "I've found you." David unplugged everything in the apartment, the clock, the television, the router. But the static remained, growing louder, filling the room until he could hear nothing else. And then came the knock. A soft, deliberate knock at his door. David froze. His apartment was on the third floor. The door opened onto a secured hallway. No one should have been able to get in. Tap, tap, tap. He stepped toward the peephole, against every instinct, and looked out. The hallway was empty, yet as he stared, the static fell silent, replaced by a voice so close, so near, it felt as if it came from just behind him. "Let me in." David spun around. The room was empty, but the voice had sounded so real, so near that he could almost feel its breath on his neck. Without thinking, he grabbed his keys and fled into the night. The cold air of the city never felt so welcome. He didn't stop until he found shelter in the bright, sleepless glow of a 24-hour diner. David never returned to that apartment. But no matter where he went, no matter how far, sometimes, in the dead of night, the static would return. And with it, the voice, soft and patient, always waiting. Let me in. David kept moving. He never stayed in one place for long. Motel rooms, friends' couches, tiny rented rooms where the locks felt too thin and the windows too wide. But no matter where he went, the presence followed. Sometimes it started with static, faint, like the crackle of an old radio far off in the distance. Other times, it was a soft knock at the door, at the window, at the thin walls of whatever room he was trying to sleep in. And always, after the static or the knocking, came the voice. David. Sometimes it sounded sad, like the lost woman he'd heard in the woods that night. Other times, it was low and cold, like wind through dead trees. You can't run forever. One evening, after nearly a year of sleepless nights and constant travel, David found himself at the edge of another forest. It wasn't planned. He'd driven all day, too tired to think, and ended up at a roadside inn surrounded by thick pine. That night, the static came louder than ever. His room felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing down on him. And from beyond the window, hidden among the trees, the voice called, "Come back." The knocking started again, first at the window, then at the door, then from the walls themselves. David, let me in. He pressed his hands to his ears, squeezed his eyes shut, and waited for dawn. When the first gray light crept over the horizon, the sounds stopped. The forest outside was still, the trees silent and empty. But carved into the wood of the window frame, deep and jagged as if made by claws or long, sharp nails, were 3 words. You are mine. David stared at the words carved into the window frame, his breath fogging the glass as the cold dawn light seeped into the room. You are mine. The letters were deep, splintering the wood, as if whatever had written them hadn't just scratched the surface, it had wanted to mark him, to claim him. Something inside David broke in that moment. Running hadn't worked, hiding hadn't worked. The thing, whatever it was, had followed him across cities, through crowds, behind locked doors. He couldn't escape it, but maybe he could face it. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, David made a decision. He stepped outside for the first time after dark since leaving the cabin. The air was still. The forest loomed, black and endless. He walked toward it, heart pounding, the soft crunch of dead leaves loud beneath his boots. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself were pulling him in. And then, in the thick silence, the static began. Not from a radio, not from anything he could see. Just there, in the air, in his ears, in his bones. The voice came with it. You came back. David kept walking, deeper into the trees. The darkness wrapped around him, thick and smothering. But he didn't stop. I've waited so long. The trees thinned, and he stepped into a small clearing. The moon slipped from behind a cloud, casting pale light over the ground, and there, at the far edge of the clearing, stood a figure. Tall, thin, its face hidden in shadow. The static grew louder, almost deafening. David, let me in. David took a breath. His voice shook, but he spoke, for the first time since that night in 2010. What do you want from me? The figure didn't move, but the voice answered, soft and close, as if whispering right into his ear. You invited me, when you listened. David's mind raced back to that night, to the radio, to the voice pleading for help. You heard me, and now you're mine. The figure stepped forward into the moonlight, and at last, David saw its face. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't anything human at all. Its eyes were hollow. Its mouth stretched far too wide. And where its heart should have been, there was only a deep, empty void that seemed to hum with the same static that filled David's head. And as it reached for him, the forest swallowed them both. David stumbled back as the creature's hollow eyes bore into him, the void where its heart should have been pulsing with an eerie static that echoed inside his skull. Fear threatened to paralyze him, but somehow he found the strength to speak once more. Why me? The creature's whisper was like the wind through dead leaves, cold, endless, and final. Because you listened, because you answered. With a sudden motion, it lunged forward, and David felt a coldness spread through his chest, a pulling, as if the void inside the creature was reaching inside him, trying to fill its endless hunger. He fought, grasping at the air, but the darkness was overwhelming. His vision blurred, the moonlight fading into shadow. And then, just as the world seemed to slip away, a sound. A sharp crack, a burst of light. David gasped awake, back in his motel room, drenched in sweat. The first rays of dawn were peeking through the curtains. He looked at his hands, trembling but whole. The room was quiet, no static, no voice. For now, he was free. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't over. The creature was still out there, waiting for the next time someone listened. and someday, it would call again.